increasingly important for folks who work in, the consulting and nonprofit sectors to help those communities prioritize, because no one's going to do it for you. The programs aren't going to do it for you because they're not going to be government based. Obviously, private foundations will have their own priorities, but I think it's more important than ever that communities sit down and identify what their priorities are.
For every one meal that a food bank provides, SNAP provides 9 other meals. So even if SNAP, which is the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program provided by the federal government through the USDA, if that's cut in the budget by 10%, then the nonprofits that feed the hungry will have to double their output just to remain the same. This is a quote from Kevin Strathman, who is the chair of Harvesters, which is a very large food bank in the Kansas City metro area, chair of their board. But interestingly, Kevin is also the CFO of Dairy Farmers of America, which is the largest dairy cooperative in the United States. And I think a super important voice to be added to the support of keeping SNAP where it is, at least. It actually, in my opinion, needs to be increased to help those that are in need, but to at least keep it the same and not decrease it in the budget because of the stress on our food banks at the very least. So I decided to ask a couple of my friends to join me today, and I'll let them introduce themselves with their titles. And so I'm going to add them to the conversation. Welcome, Christy Davis and Nick Lewandowski. Christy, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Christy Davis. I'm a 5th generation Kansan. I live in Chase County, and I recently served in the Biden administration as the state director for USDA Rural Development.
Nick, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Dawn, and thank you, Christy. I'm Nick Lewandowski. I'm also a 5th generation Kansan. I'm up in Republic County, and I am the executive director of the Kansas Farmers Union. We're a general farm organization, been around since 1907.
Thank you both.
But Nick hasn't been around since 1907.
No. The Lewandowskis have been farming in Kansas since 1869, though. So
wow, very good.
I've said that a lot here lately. So,
well, my family, I can say, is also 5th generation, and we beat Nick's family by a couple years because my ancestor brought the wagon trains out. So he was the first settler in the same county Nick is from. So that's how I know Nick.
Yeah.
But
they got a little community named after him. And
they did. But they brought, if you want to build a community, you bring people you like. So I'm assuming he thought your family was pretty fun to be with. So come on out.
Well, sure.
So, Christy, could you explain maybe just a touch on the historical connection between agriculture and nutrition bill in the Farm Bill? I know that our own past Senator Bob Dole was a big part of that, but I don't think even people working in the nonprofit food industries really understand why SNAP is in the USDA Farm Bill.
Well, I want to say that as far as ag policy and rural policy, Kansas has taken the lead for, since the beginning of Kansas, at least. We've been involved, and this, there's only 2 states mentioned in the 1860 Republican Party platform. One of them is Kansas. And so we were interested, of course, in Homestead Act and other programs, and those are mentioned within the context of Kansas in the Farm Bill, or in the original Republican Party platform. Kansas played a huge role during the 20th century, in particular, in developing the Farm Bill. And there was a concerted effort. There was a time when there were a lot of Kansans in leadership. Obviously, we had folks who were chairing the House and Senate ag committees at the same time that we had an ag secretary from Kansas with Dan Glickman. And so there was a lot of Kansas input in a pretty masterful negotiation that's been happening for a very long time, and a concerted effort to have SNAP benefits, to have nutrition benefits in the Farm Bill, with the idea at the time that you needed balance. As more and more people become urban, fewer people understand, people can understand the nutrition issues, but they don't understand farming per se or what those policies mean. And so the idea is that's a way to get people from all different backgrounds behind the Farm Bill. I think it's pretty interesting now to look at nutrition benefits, because I think those of us in rural America still see SNAP. I think a lot of folks see what we used to call food stamps as an urban thing. We see poverty as an urban thing. And the truth is we have a lot of poverty in rural areas. Yes, even in Kansas. And there's a higher percentage of rural Americans on SNAP benefits than urban. And so it's been considered an urban issue. It's been considered a way to balance the Farm Bill over time. But really, it's a huge rural issue as well. So that was a concerted effort. Historically, Kansas took the lead on that. And now, as we're in this current administration, it's really been driven by some of the policy outlines in Project 2025, which include splitting them out again in the Farm Bill. So that creates some concern because it was done for a good reason. There was a compromise reason for that, to get a broad base of support behind the Farm Bill.
Thank you. And Nick, that being said about the history, what's the current status of the Farm Bill in layman's terms? Because most of us don't even understand that work in the food bank industry and whatnot.
Yeah. So the current Farm Bill that we're operating under is the 2018 Farm Bill. And it has been extended twice now. It expired the first time in September of 2023, actually September 30th of 2023. An extension was made then to extend it to September 30th of 2024. Well, we've passed that date as well. So back in December, when we passed the continuing resolution to fund the government, they also extended the 2018 Farm Bill again, now to September 30th of 2025. So Farm Bills usually only run about 4 to 6 years. So we're right now getting to that 7-year mark, or getting close to that 7-year mark. And a lot has happened in those years since 2018. Obviously, we had the pandemic, COVID-19, and that changed a lot of things in the world, but especially around food and agriculture. So there's a lot of things that have certainly changed in agriculture and rural communities. And that's why we need to have a Farm Bill that's updated that 4 to 6 year time period. Right now, we have a new Congress. Obviously, the 119th Congress came into effect back in January. And, about a month or so ago, the topic of discussion was, we're going to get this Farm Bill going again. We're going to pick up where we left off. And of course, there's new leadership in both the House and Senate when it comes to the ag committees. So that was very promising until all of these major changes to government started happening through the cuts that we're seeing in this administration. And you haven't heard a whole lot of talk lately about the Farm Bill because of that. And that is concerning. The talk, like I said, a month and a half ago, was that they wanted to try to get the Farm Bill done, worked through both committees, and then passed by the August recess. Well, here we are. It's early March. August is only a few short months away, 5 months away. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort to get a big bipartisan omnibus bill like the Farm Bill passed. And with each passing day and every other challenge that we're seeing now in this administration, it becomes more and more difficult, I think, to get a bill of this size passed. So lately, the talk has been that there may be another extension that comes, at some point, maybe as we get closer to that September 30th deadline. And then the thought of trying to do another Farm Bill during an election year next year in 2026 scares a lot of folks. So I've heard talk that there may be even an extension to get us into 2027 under the current Farm Bill, which I do not like the sound of that. I think that's a bad approach to go down because a lot can happen between now and then. And I think we need to address the problems that we're dealing with right now in agriculture and nutrition and all of those things, rural development. All of those things need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed sooner than 2027.
Thank you. Yes. There's a part of me, and I'm sure there are executive directors in the area of food banks that would agree that we just keep coasting, just keep pushing it out because it's not a decrease, right? But there are a lot of other things that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Can you let's just chat about that. What are some things that need to be addressed that we should be concerned about? You mentioned rural development, some things.
Well, Christy, I'll let you take that on.
Sure. Well, so the Farm Bill is divided up into different titles, and there's a title for rural development. Traditionally, each one of those titles has its own, politically appointed leadership. I would just say that one of the biggest issues with the Farm Bill, and this applies to rural development and everything else, is that it helps create some certainty. It levels things out a little bit. Everybody knows the rule book and knows what to expect for years to come, rather than flying by the seat of their pants. So we've been talking about SNAP benefits, but there's so many things in the rural development title as well. And I'll give a few examples of that. As Congress continues to kick the can as far as funding and appropriations, a lot of these things, get chipped away at, and so it's not as whole as it generally is. But among the things included in the rural development title are things like the rural housing service. Just an example, in Kansas during the Biden administration, we had 4,000 single-family housing projects in Kansas. And that means that the federal government provided loan guarantees and in some cases direct lending to folks in rural areas, because it can be a huge challenge to finance single-family houses in rural areas, whether you're buying a house that already exists or you're building a new one. It can be really tough. And so those loan guarantees help banks do their job. That's an example. And we talked a little bit, I think, about, Project 2025. That actually calls for eliminating the rural housing service. And that's a problem. In addition to housing, when you think of the rural housing service, people think of housing, obviously. We have multifamily housing programs and single family housing programs. It also impacts our community programs funding. So the things that within the rural housing service, there are programs that fund clinics and hospitals and childcares. And hospitals, as you know, are a really big deal. Without the financing that USDA Rural Development provides, those projects just couldn't happen. And so those are issues. And with the uncertainty, what's happening is there are projects that are currently underway that are a little up in the air, where they're waiting to be, they've sometimes been placed on hold and waiting to be reimbursed. That's an issue. We know that I think there's some folks in urban areas who may not understand that the housing shortage extends to rural communities. They think of rural communities as shrinking, and we must have a lot of housing stock that's just sitting there waiting for someone to snatch up. That's not the case. We have a lot of aging housing stock, as we know from the current state administration's housing plan. So rural areas are in desperate need for housing, and that's how you can make those programs work. With hospitals, we're already struggling in Kansas to finance those projects because the numbers are tough. We're in a state that doesn't have Medicaid expansion. And when you're a small hospital and you're running your numbers, it's really hard to justify those improvements needed to keep your hospital open. And so we're already, in a challenging situation. And then you start threatening the funding through the rural housing service. People don't recognize that greatly impacts other things besides housing.
Right. The infrastructure itself in our rural areas is shored up by
Yep.
organizations that hold the grants that the federal government sends out. And you were mentioning medicine and healthcare. A lot of our hospitals and clinics receive federal funding in rural areas so that they can be in existence. And then I know, because I personally worked a couple of those grants where even telemedicine is supported financially by these federal government grants, some through the USDA, some through other departments. And that when those are decreased, it's a true threat to the services provided. It's a true threat to the nonprofits that are providing those services. Because if the nonprofit goes away, the service goes away, and the nonprofit is going to do everything it can not to have that happen. Nick, I know you're on your local hospital board there in Republic County. How are things with the small rural hospitals? And currently, without any added stress that financially tariffs or anything else might put on things.
Yeah, so actually, I'm on the Healthcare Foundation board.
I see.
Two different boards there. There's the hospital board and then Healthcare Foundation for Republic County Hospital. But we're the NCK Healthcare Foundation is what we are. And originally, we were set up to just deal with recruitment of physicians to the hospital. This was done back in I want to say it was the late 1980s. So kind of a unique system set up where we raised funds from people in the community. People donated, estate gifts and, made annual pledges to really focus on that, bringing, physicians into the community, into the hospital system and our clinic, and then, retaining them and keeping them in our communities. So we've been at this now for a good number of years, obviously, and it's worked very well. We've been able to attract a lot of new and young physicians to Republic County, and we're really proud of that. But since the time that I've been on the board, I was on previously. I had moved away then, and when I came back in 2022, I was asked to come back on the board. We've expanded our efforts a little bit to also include the purchase of medical equipment for the hospital and the clinic, and to also assist in upgrades to the facilities, especially at our clinic, because they used to be two separate entities. Our clinic was separate from the hospital, but the doctors worked in both. They were employed by the hospital, but they had their own private practices across the street. Well, now we've merged everything together, and we're finding that our building, our medical clinic building, needs a lot of upgrades. It was built in the mid 1990s, so we're looking at an almost 30-year-old building, and it needs a refresh. It needs some updating. And so now we are putting some of those funds into that facility so that it makes it a more attractive space for potential physician recruitment, but it also makes it a better space for the people of Republic County and the surrounding area that utilize that clinic. Just making those necessary improvements and upgrades. And the reason we're doing that, frankly, is because we know that our tax base is dwindling. Folks are already feeling that burden, especially our landowners, people that are property owners. And so when we can take those funds that we have access to, and we're very grateful for especially the estate gifts that we've received that have been phenomenal over the years, but also just the donations that are coming in during our telethon that we do. We do a radio telethon every, I think it's in October, November. We invite people to call in and pledge, and it can be $5, it can be $5,000. It's whatever you can afford But those are dollars that we match dollar for dollar then toward these projects, because we're able to do that now. We're sitting in a good financial spot, but not everybody has that capability, and I understand that. I know that. We have been fortunate, but I'm worried though that we're going to have to rely more on these private foundations, these community foundations, to step up and fill that gap, especially if the federal government is no longer going to, allow for these kinds of grants and funds to address these issues.
I think it's a real concern, and I think as we move forward, and I want to point out something that kind of reiterates what the original premise in the opinion piece was. It's hard enough to do what we're doing in the rural areas, even in Kansas City. You can bring that into the big pool in feeding people, medicating people, housing people. It's hard enough to do what we were doing to begin with without the added stressor of possible financial difficulties. A possible recession in the Midwest, I don't think is out of the question to call it, if the tariffs stay in place and any cuts start coming down the road in Medicaid. It's almost going to be a tsunami of difficulty in rural areas. Christy, you work a lot with different rural communities as they're trying to just expand their physical needs with buildings and stuff, and that's your area, rural development. What's your take on that?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this. Obviously, we have some great nonprofit foundations in Kansas that do focus on rural. Patterson Foundation and Hanson Foundation are examples of that. What I see is there's the government funding piece, but what people don't understand is, the government works for us, the people, and they help us level the playing field, and they help us prioritize what the needs are. They have priorities for funding, and that's how those decisions are made. Unfortunately, when you don't have these, strong government organizations, for instance, at USDA Rural Development, there has not been an undersecretary named, and it's not expected that will happen during the Trump administration. He never appointed an undersecretary during his first Trump administration, and they're calling for eliminating RHS altogether. So that's a concern. What that does is it creates a little bit of a schizophrenic environment where nothing goes through priorities. It's the priorities of the funders themselves. And we saw this in the early 20th century, right? You've got the worthy poor. You've got certain hoops that people have to go through in order to access funding. When those hoops are established by the government, those priorities are established by people who work for us, for the people. We don't know, what the priorities of those funders might be in the future. The more information we have, the easier it is to prioritize. So I think that one role that nonprofits can play right now, and they've begun to play. I mean, the Hanson Foundation, I think, has done a great job of this because they're working, in a set region and establishing some priorities. But nonprofits, consultants, folks who work with these communities, the biggest issue that I see is that they're living hand to mouth already, and they don't necessarily have master plans where they've identified their priorities. So I think it's going to be increasingly important for folks who work in, the consulting and nonprofit sectors to help those communities prioritize, because no one's going to do it for you. The programs aren't going to do it for you because they're not going to be government based. Obviously, private foundations will have their own priorities, but I think it's more important than ever that communities sit down and identify what their priorities are. I do want to give an example of that, something that I see a lot of. A lot of times when you have, you've got volunteer folks who are running these communities. 79% of our communities in Kansas, our municipalities, are 1,500 or fewer people. And they're run by volunteers, and they don't have time to sit down and write plans. And sometimes when they do, they go on the shelf. But it is, because these are volunteers, it's very difficult for them to establish priorities when you're in a small community, because you're always going to offend someone, or you're afraid you're going to. And one of the areas where I see that happening is in the area of infrastructure, and in particular with water. None of these public officials who are volunteers necessarily want to, admit on a daily basis or have in an open hearing that, folks might turn the faucet on one day and there won't be water. I mean, that would be just a killer for their communities, but that is happening. And without this funding in place, there's not going to be government money for it. So how do you plan for that? And when you have a community that isn't educated about what the issues are, and they don't know you've got a water problem because you're keeping it quiet, it's really tough to add that to the list of priorities. And I think most folks would say that clean water is among the most important items, but it may not be, sexy for a funder to fund. Those are the types of projects that we need government to step up and take care of.
I love that you brought that up as a solution for groups, is to seek those outside foundations, and they're good for more than money. They're good for planning, strategic planning outside of the city limits of, say, a 500-person town. Some of our counties have less than 2,000 people.
Yep.
So seeking that outside resource of people who understand strategic planning and reaching for different funding sources, and prioritizing, triaging.
Yeah.
There's just so much going on in your area. I don't care even if you're a small college town of 25,000, there's so much going on in your area that you have to learn to triage, which is what I was hearing you say. Here's this hidden problem in some of the communities, which is water. I know some of our small communities have had to put in whole new water treatment systems.
Yep.
And they're extraordinarily expensive without that federal funding. With the sheer magnitude of what is going on and the cuts that we've already seen, everything, I know you both are super aware of it, and people may not be aware how in rural areas, even our weather service being cut, which it was dramatically cut last week or the week before. It's hard to keep track at some points. And that we had a major storm pass through the middle of the United States last night and yesterday. And those weather services were stressed with not enough human beings to get the word out. And I noticed that the Kansas City Public Radio had an interview this morning about how that weather is even fed to our weather bug on our phone, and how the weather is fed over to the news stations. And it all comes from the National Weather Service that they cut, and that getting that information out with a lot fewer people and eyeballs looking at and able to evaluate was really hard. And it wasn't even the worst storm we've all experienced last night. It was a storm and it was bad, but they were having difficulties. Everything from water, weather, health systems, food, insecurity systems. This is a lot.
Yep.
This is a lot. And we haven't even touched on what you two as experts, especially maybe you, Nick, might foresee in income drop within the agriculture industry, which is a huge portion of Middle America's economics. So when the farmer is hit, the grocery stores are hit, the restaurants are hit, definitely. It just is a rolling wave of economic decrease. Mm-hmm. So But that's my way of introducing. Nick, what do you think if I'm a large nonprofit
Mhm.
in our state of Kansas or anywhere in the Midwest, but say it's in Kansas, a large nonprofit, larger for us, and I just need to plan. I need to plan that there's going to be an economy decrease if with the tariff cuts. What would you say that might be? What should I prepare for? What kind of level? I mean, what's it going to do to the farming economy?
Well, immediately I think of when farmers aren't making money, and you hinted at this, Dawn. When farmers are not making money, they're not spending money. And like you said, when they are doing well financially, they are spending money in their community. And that money revolves on itself. There's that local multiplier effect. For every dollar you spend, it revolves on itself, I think, 7 times in a local economy. And you can see it. You can see it everywhere you go in rural America, that people are struggling. When farmers aren't buying new farm equipment, when they're not trading pickups, when they're not, spending some of that income that they have at that local level, you can tell there's a problem. And that reverberates, it ripples out throughout the community, obviously. So when these foundations are operating in their community, they have to take notice of that. I remember here a few years ago when we were doing our telethon for the Healthcare Foundation, and we used to set goals. We used to say, okay, we want to try to bring in 20,000 this year. We want to try to bring in 25,000, whatever the amount might be. And I kept telling folks on the board, I said, listen, we're going to have to keep our expectations in check. That things are not all rose-colored glasses. Things aren't looking good for the farm economy. The national economy looked fine, but the farm economy did not. And they're two very different things. And I think people don't quite understand that. I think people think, well, the economy is the economy is the economy. And that's not the case. Farmers have been operating on, under depressed commodity prices for some time. Yesterday, with the announce of the tariffs, they took another major hit. And then you factor in the input costs that farmers have to deal with. Your seed costs, your fertilizer, your spray and chemicals, equipment costs, fuel costs, all of those things have to be factored into this. And, a lot of times farmers are, not making any money or maybe just barely breaking even in some cases, depending on how big your farm is and your operation is. So it's understanding that reality that not everything is going to be bright and peachy and wonderful for everybody. And we have seen a drawback in the size of donations, in the number of donations. We're still, doing okay when we do these telethons and things, and we're still seeing, some very generous donations, but not as many and not as big a donation as we've seen from farmers when they're doing well. We time that telethon right around fall harvest because that's usually a time when farmers are bringing that grain in, they're selling it, they've got cash on hand sometimes. So we try to time it during that. But we're finding now in many cases that those donations are fewer and they're smaller.
I want to add to what Nick said too. I think, and this is something I'm sure Nick's heard me say 100 times, but you're right that the farm economy doesn't necessarily follow the trends of the national economy, but I think it's also important to note that farming, ranching plays a huge role in the economies of these rural communities, but only 2% of the population of rural America is actively engaged in farming. And so you can't rely just on subsidies for farming. When you're addressing policy issues related to rural America, addressing farming alone isn't enough because these are communities that have suffered many decades of disinvestment, where 98% of the population is not engaged in farming. Do they rely on the farming and ranching economies to keep their communities thriving? Yes. Are those folks leaders in their community? Absolutely. Is farming and ranching just, hugely essential to the economy of Kansas? Yes. But I think that when I'm talking to state legislators and even, staffs of members of Congress, there's this idea that if you're helping farmers, you're helping rural America, and you are. But I think we need to recognize that the rural economy is more than the farming and ranching economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll just tag on to that. My mom was a school teacher for 36 years. One of the top professions in the county, aside from healthcare and agriculture, and that's a big part of it. And thank goodness she did teach, because a lot of times it was her paycheck that was putting food on the table. Yep. And a lot of times it was her health insurance, because she's the only one that had it, that made sure that, that I had dental appointments and medical appointments, and my sister as well. And all of us were covered by her school health insurance. So, yeah, I mean, it is beyond, as Christy said, the ag economy. It is the rural economy. And so many play a part in that.
Well, and Nick, you mentioned education. Obviously, in most of the rural communities that we live in, the school might be often is the largest employer. Yeah. Sometimes in the county, sometimes in each community. And one of the areas that they're looking at cuts is Title I funding for education. And there are schools that qualify because they're rural schools for additional funding. So that's another area where folks are going to take a hit. And I anticipate that what that may look like, that may be, more than the foundations can handle or individual communities can handle. And I would expect a lot of consolidation, and that's going to be a huge challenge because so many communities tie their identity up with their schools. I live in Chase County. We're fortunate we have a countywide school district, so we've been consolidated, and hopefully that will protect us. But there are a lot of schools, especially I think about Northwest Kansas, very sparsely populated, and they're schools that are hanging on, and they're able to do it in part because of Title I funding, and that funding is being threatened. And we know too in Kansas, let's say your local school goes under, well, you don't have a choice. In rural Kansas, there isn't, quote, choice. We know that it costs about $20,000 a year to educate a public school child in Kansas. 10% of that, which seems small, but 10% of that comes from the federal government. The rest from state. Oftentimes our state policies follow federal policies. And the truth is, as a parent, I can't afford to write a check for $20,000 every year for someone to educate my kid. Those are the kinds of things that are going to have just an exponential impact in rural communities as well, because you lose your identity when you lose your school. Yep. And the whole reason people living in rural areas often is because of community, right? And that's a huge part of it. That's the glue often that holds these communities together.
And I'm hearing a common theme as we wrap this up. There's so much we've touched on, but a common theme is, I think when you started, Christy, you mentioned that our rural people use SNAP more at a higher percentage. And to be truthful, and I think we all three know this, but I'm not sure everybody knows that rural areas use federal dollars at a higher rate in all areas.
Yeah. We get more than we give.
Yeah. We get more than we give. Healthcare, schooling, infrastructure. We were talking about water and even housing, and definitely with food insecurity, we'd already talked about. So as we wrap up, this has been a very downer, a little bit of a downer happening here. And I don't really want it to be a downer. I do see the positive that you brought out, Christy, of make sure you use your foundations to help you plan. Because some, maybe all of these plans from Project 2025 are going to be implemented. We really, every single day is a revelation lately. I don't know about you, but I'm getting a little exhausted, news exhaustion, and Band-Aids are being ripped off way too regular for my comfort. But that doesn't mean that we can just throw our hands up, right? And not provide services through all the organizations you, I are involved in. But so I really love you pointing that out, Christy. Thank you, about the foundations. I also really hear you both are very involved in your communities, and I know that about you, but I recommend that we all get more involved and in the planning process and helping to plan for worst case scenario. Let me put it that way, that we need to plan for worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm upset that so many of our local communities and public community foundations, public organizations that we have are going to have to ask folks that will be hurting themselves to dig deeper for their own communities. Any last thoughts from the two of you as we move forward? There was just a lot that we brought out, but I think it's very informative if people are unaware of how interdependent, right? How interdependent these different line items in the federal budget are to rural areas, and how they will impact our community foundations. They'll impact our community smaller nonprofits than the foundations. Nick, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I was at a meeting last weekend with both of you, and I came across a vendor that had some buttons, and that one button said DGU on it, and I got to thinking, what in the world could that mean? And it meant don't give up. And I think that's a good reminder to all of us that we shouldn't give up in these trying times. We shouldn't feel defeated or deflated. All of those words. But it also means we're going to probably have to learn how to live a little leaner than we have in years past, and we're going to have to be a little more self-reliant. And maybe that won't be such a bad thing after all, because I think we're going to get to know each other a little better that way, and understand what the true needs are especially in our rural communities. And it's going to help us to prioritize and understand what it is we want to look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, if not further. And what that might mean, what kind of commitment that's going to mean from us. If there's certain things that we want to do, if there's certain goals that we have in mind, or maybe it's going to be a time where we step back and realize, okay, we're sitting kind of right where we need to be. Why don't we just kind of self-sustain right here for now, and then let this time pass and all of that. So I think there's going to be a lot of that happening over time, at least for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. That's some good advice. Don't give up, and just pull in the tentacles a little bit and hibernate and plan for the future. I like that. Christy, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I suspect that most people who are your audience are leaders in their community, or at least in their hearts, and oftentimes people that folks listen to. I would just encourage folks. It is very tempting to hole up, in your house and take care of yourself, and sometimes that takes a lot of energy and time. I would just encourage folks to keep showing up and keep communicating. Communicate. There's lots of ways to communicate. Op-eds in the newspaper, if you have a newspaper. If you're lucky enough to have a newspaper, help keep them going, because it's important that we all have shared information and we all have the same information. But showing up, communicating, not just social media. It's very important that we talk one-on-one in person with our neighbors, because those are the conversations where knowledge, is passed, and folks who have a different skill set or understanding than you do, you can listen to them and see where they're coming from. So I think that's my advice. Is it's very easy to hole up and become isolated. This is not the time to do that. It's really important to band together as a community, and that means communicating and sharing information not just on social media, but in person. That's what makes rural communities tick.
Thank you. And I really hear what you're saying is that go back to the basics of how we community build and communicate one-on-one in person with people, not forgetting the social media, but don't just rely on it. And making sure
sources they can trust. And when you have someone face to face, and it's someone in your community that you've known and you've known their family for generations, that's very different. That means something.
It's a huge part of what we do with nonprofits is that we work one-on-one with our donors, our partners in philanthropy, in asking them what they would like to do within their interests of supporting the nonprofits. And you don't generally do that through social media. There's the GoFundMes and things like that, but that's not the best way to raise money. So we know in our hearts with nonprofits what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to get out there and really look somebody in the eye and talk from their heart and your heart and come together on how to solve the problems. I think that's really good advice, Christy. And we need to make sure and do it outside of the parameters of donations also, right? And just build that community, because we're going to have to deal with the fundraising, but we have to build the community first. Thank you both for joining me today. I didn't mean to bum me out, but it's important information. And you guys have a perspective that even in smaller towns, people don't get. So I appreciate you both. Thank you for your time and for your devotion to your own communities. You're great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us with the Philanthropy Geek. This is where we take a look at the day's news and seeing how it really affects us on the front lines of serving our missions. Please like and subscribe and share with a coworker or a friend.